I want to try to deal with the question, how can a person learn to perceive reality more clearly and immediately? How can he learn to see day-to-day life through what I'm going to refer to as the Gnostic Lens, or through the eyes of an Illuminatus? And by this, I mean through the eyes of a person who has experienced illumination, not through the eyes of a member of a shadowy secret group hell-bent on taking over the world and enslaving humanity under a new world order. In the past, I've defined illumination as the direct experience of reality as it is. And so it isn't anything supernatural. Nothing could be more ordinary. What's truly extraordinary is that somehow we've come to experience a kind of illusion in place of reality. It's a projection of our own imaginations, individually and collectively. We externalize our fears and desires. We experience the world around us, and even the world within us, through a heavily distorted lens. The way we remember the past, and the way we imagine the future, shapes the way we experience the present. Our beliefs and expectations condition our imagination to fill in the gaps. And there are always gaps in our perception. Our imagination fills in these gaps. And it's very difficult to draw the line between what we perceive and what we imagine. It's hard to say how much is which, but half or more of what you experience as reality is actually generated by your own imagination, attempting to fill in missing data and generate a coherent narrative, which is congruent with your past experiences and future expectations. And this much is true whether you adopt a Gnostic worldview or not. But if you accept that, in some sense, the material world is a kind of illusion, then the situation is even more extreme. Because not only are you faced with the fact that an unknown percentage of what you experience as real is a projection of your own imagination, but you're also faced with the fact that even that part of your experience which isn't just a projection of your own mind is a kind of illusion. In effect, you're trapped inside the dream of a sleeping god. It's up to you how literally you want to take this. Personally, I view it as a kind of metaphor, but I view it as a metaphor that's probably as close to being literally true as any metaphor could be. I'm not going to attempt to argue in favor of this model here, because I've done that in other videos. I'm just going to proceed as if we've agreed to accept this model as essentially true. In other words, I'm continuing the discussion from within the metaphysical framework of idealism. Not necessarily any particular idealist philosophy, but just a general form of idealism. In terms of the 7 Hermetic principles, this is the principle of mentalism. All is mind. Reality is mental in nature. If you want to understand how a Gnostic or an Illuminatus thinks, it seems you have to start from this understanding. So moving on, as I've said before, in order to conceptually grasp what a thing is, it seems that we're forced to form an opposing concept of what that thing is not. It also seems to help us to be able to have a concept of something else that is like this thing. If you look up the definition of any word, you're likely to find that the description compares it to something similar and contrasts it against something different. This just seems to be how the mind works. This seems to be necessary in order for the mind to form concepts. This is why the Hermetic principles of correspondence and polarity logically follow from the Hermetic principle of mentalism. And so if we accept the Hermetic principle of mentalism, then it's logical to conclude that if this is how the mind operates, and if the universe is mental, then this is a law of the universe as well, and not merely a law of our own mental perception. If this is true, is good news for us, because it means that the laws that govern the way we perceive reality are the same laws that govern what we experience as reality. And this means that knowledge is possible. If materialism is true, then it's difficult to see how we could ever have knowledge. If the laws that govern our mental perception and conceptualization of reality are different from the laws that govern the physical universe, then we're forced to admit that reality as we perceive it is different from reality as it actually is. And so if materialism is true, then we can never know anything. And if we can never know anything, then obviously this means that we can never know that materialism is true. All of science is based on our observations and experiences of reality. If we can't trust those observations and experiences, then we can't trust science. We can only trust scientific knowledge if idealism or mentalism is true. And so I have to laugh when a materialist accuses me of being against science if I'm against materialism. I laugh because he's the one who is denying science. If materialism is true, science is false. The materialist, if he's honest, will defend his decision by saying that even though he'll admit we can't know for certain that science is true, he is rationally justified in believing that it's true because it works. My response to that is that the fact that science does seem to work is an argument in favor of the mentalist position and against the materialist position. I don't claim that my argument proves idealism. That's debatable. But if someone is honest enough to admit that he can't prove materialism either, and that we can't ultimately know which position is true, then at this point we can either choose to remain agnostic on the question, or we can choose to believe the more reasonable of the two options and reject the less reasonable. So again, this argument isn't necessarily intended to prove that one view is true and the other false, but only that it's more rational to believe one than the other. My argument here is that idealism is the more reasonable position. So being an idealist doesn't mean I don't believe in science. On the contrary, it means that I, unlike the materialist, have a metaphysical framework that rationally justifies my trust in science. In other words, my deductive reasoning rationally justifies my use of inductive reasoning, and my inductive reasoning empirically justifies my use of deductive reasoning. I say this because, as I said before, science seems to work. And the fact that science seems to work points toward the truth of idealism. The empirical method points to a universe that is intelligible, and one which operates according to objective and universal laws. And in idealism, the universe is mental. So it would seem contradictory to say that the universe follows objective and universal laws, but to deny that the mind does. If anyone thinks that this is a circular argument, they don't understand what a circular argument is, and they should look up the definition, and they will see that it isn't. It's more like the I think therefore I am argument, which deduces a logically necessary premise from a self-evidently true conclusion. This is very different from a circular argument, which reaches a non-self-evident conclusion by assuming that unjustified conclusion in the logically unnecessary premise. In some ways, the ability to perceive such a distinction is what this video is about. A person who is able to perceive such a distinction understands the structure of logic or the structure of mind. We might say he is a man who knows himself, since he himself is a mind. He himself has come to know the living logos, or the living word, as the New Testament translates it. A new faculty of perception has been awakened in him. Poetically speaking, it's as if a third eye has opened. When he looks at a series of events, he sees beyond the mere events. He sees a pattern behind them. And he is able to perceive this same pattern behind another apparently unrelated series of events. Behind actions, he's able to perceive principles. A person who is only able to see the actions themselves will often have difficulty understanding moral truth, because moral truth is found in the principles behind the actions. A person who only hears an argument, but is unable to see the presuppositions and implications behind the argument, will have difficulty judging the truthfulness or falsehood of the argument. But an Illuminatus will be able to see beyond the mere words. He will see the structure. And the truth of an argument is determined at the level of the structure of the argument, not at the level of mere words. The structure is either sound or unsound. If the structure is invalid, according to the laws of reason which govern the mental universe, then the argument is invalid. The words themselves are irrelevant. An Illuminatus will also be able to discern spirits. By this I don't mean anything spooky or supernatural, as some may imagine. I only mean that they're able to perceive and identify forms or archetypes. One person may embody the wise old man archetype, while another person may embody the trickster archetype. One man may be ruled by Mars, so to speak, which is to say that a warlike spirit is acting through him. This is how an illuminated man understands the gods. The gods are very much involved in human affairs, and they're very real. As occultists have discovered, it's possible to create a map of correspondences between the gods of one pantheon and the gods of another. This points toward the fact that these are objectively real entities. Whenever I press a materialist to offer proof or evidence that what he calls the physical universe is objectively real and independent of subjective mental perception, he will often point to the fact that other people all perceive the same thing. He will argue that the natural world must be objectively real, because multiple observers all share a common experience of it, and therefore it can't merely be the product of their individual minds. If we accept this argument with regard to the existence of the material universe, then why not with respect to the gods? The argument is either valid or invalid. If it's valid, then it's valid in both cases. If invalid, then invalid in both cases. The model I propose suggests that what we call the material universe, as well as what we call the gods, are emanations of the universal mind, and exist within it. So they are not mind-independent in the ultimate sense. But they are mind-independent from the more limited perspective of our individual finite minds, which are also emanations of the one universal mind, of course. And this understanding of reality as a series of emanations, including a hierarchy of gods, is central to the Gnostic and esoteric perspective. And actually perceiving and experiencing existence in this way is perhaps the essence of the spiritually illuminated Gnostic consciousness. I say perceiving and experiencing, not conceiving and conceptualizing. In another talk, I made a distinction between Gnosticism and Gnosis, or between Illuminism and illumination. I used the term pistic to refer to one who believes, and used the term Gnostic to refer to one who knows. Pistis means faith, and Gnosis means knowledge. I compared the pistic to a man who is blindfolded. Someone else has described the world around him to him, and it may very well be an accurate description. Putting his trust in that description, and acting accordingly, may very well allow him to successfully navigate his environment. If I tell you that you're 3 feet away from the edge of a cliff and urge you to stop walking, As long as you trust me and stop walking, you'll be fine. If I tell you you're in the middle of the street and a bus is about to hit you, and urge you to move out of the way and run to your left, back to the safety of the sidewalk, you'll avoid being run over as long as you have faith in me. You'll have been saved through faith, so to speak, and this is a good thing. It's certainly better than the alternative. But surely it would be better to remove your blindfold and directly perceive the world around you, rather than rely on a kind of mental map based on someone else's direct experience. And I believe that the ability to perceive reality through reason, rather than just sense perception, is something that has to be trained and developed. I'm only talking about the eye of reason. I don't say that opening the eye of reason is the pinnacle of illumination, but it is a stage of illumination, and it's a gradual stage. One part of the training deals with removing the blindfold, so to speak. This consists in a willingness to critically examine your beliefs and reject them if they turn out to be unsupported. It requires you to detach yourself from any dogmas or ideologies you may have accepted or adopted. As long as you remain attached or invested in a particular set of ideas and opinions, you'll never be able to see the truth. In some ways, this is the easiest part, and in some ways, it's the hardest. I say that it's the easiest because it involves nothing more than simply letting go. In theory, it's the easiest, but in practice, it's the hardest. Part of this is because a person's beliefs imprison them, and the person can't see their own prison walls. They could escape very easily, but they don't even try, because they don't know they're imprisoned. The naive realist doesn't seek to directly experience reality. He thinks he's already experiencing it. He thinks that reality is nothing more than the world of sense perception. And when he dreams, he thinks his dream is real. Like a sleeping man, it isn't really possible for him to just decide to wake up. He often needs someone who is already awake to gently shake him. Or if he's in a very deep sleep, he may need someone to shake him a little more aggressively. This is what I believe most of the initiations of the mystery schools were intended to do. Very often, some form of hallucinatory drug was involved, or perhaps some other technique of inducing an altered state of consciousness. The important thing is that whatever method is used, it results in shaking the initiate loose from his mental prison. Seeing something which he knows to be impossible could also accomplish this, which is why magic tricks have been used by gurus in the past. I don't think this is effective in the modern scientific age, unless maybe it's really one hell of a convincing magic trick, but even then, I think it's much less effective. These days, most people have seen a magician levitate, at least on TV, if not live. And even if they aren't sure how the magician did it, they're convinced that there must have been some kind of trick to it. But imagine a time back before magic tricks were commonplace. These days, you can learn magic tricks online. I think most guys went through a phase when they learned a few magic tricks. Most magic tricks have been exposed online. People aren't very impressed by magic tricks anymore. Most people who decide they want to be professional magicians just end up performing at children's parties, along with clowns and balloon artists. Magic is a joke. But this hasn't always been the case. Many people have seen a TV special where a magician performs a few simple magic tricks for members of some primitive tribe living in the jungle somewhere. The reaction is quite different. They have no concept of what a magic trick is. They only know that what they just saw is impossible, but they know they saw it. Their entire model of reality is shaken. They can no longer be certain of anything. Now imagine how powerful even some simple magic tricks could be for the average person a few thousand years ago, especially if combined with a little drama and ritual, and in conjunction with some mind-altering chemical substances. Imagine a time when simple magic tricks were carefully guarded secrets which were very rarely, if ever, performed in public. Imagine a time when hallucinogenic drugs weren't sold on the street corner, and when only a few individuals knew the secret to creating these compounds. Like magic tricks, mind-altering chemical substances lack the power I believe they once had, and I believe the same is true even of drama. These days, even children are involved in school plays. The average person watches several hours of TV every day. But imagine if you had never seen a play acted out before. You've never seen a magic trick before. You've never even smoked weed before. And now, for the first time ever, as part of your initiation into some secretive mystery school, you've drank some strange drink made from a mixture of various herbs, leaves, mushrooms, fermented grapes, or whatever else. And now, for the first time ever, you find yourself taking part in some mysterious ritual and watching some dramatic myth being acted out in front of you. It's all very real. And maybe in the course of all this, a few magic tricks are performed. Even after the effect of the drink wears off, you will never perceive or experience reality in the same way ever again. For quite some time after this, you will look at everything around you as if you're seeing it for the first time, and as if you're unsure of what you're seeing, or of whether or not what you're seeing is real. You no longer know what you thought you knew. You question everything. You're not a naive realist anymore. You're an initiate. And of course, this is only the beginning. To initiate a process is simply to get it started, to kick things off. Now, the training actually begins. Now that your blindfold has been removed, the work of actually developing your visual faculty can begin. And I believe the primary method of developing the reasoning faculty was always the dialectic. The dialectic itself was always the true oral tradition, which was passed from mouth to ear, from master to student. Essentially, I'm talking about what we now know as the Socratic method. But the essential thing is the method itself, and not specific conclusions one arrives at by applying the method. Giving profound truths to a person who hasn't developed the ability to perceive truth is like casting pearls before swine. And so certain truths were reserved for initiates and were only revealed indirectly even to them. Through an interactive dialogue consisting of questions and answers, the initiate would eventually be led to discover these truths for himself. It was obviously necessary that these truths never be spoken of to anyone who hadn't discovered them already. If the correct answers were known to the student already, then it would be more difficult for the teacher to determine whether the student was actually becoming an adept or whether he was simply repeating what he had heard. The way to test a blind man, to find out if his eyes are beginning to see, is to ask him to describe various things around him. If someone else has already given him a description, how will you know? Besides, to give him any description at all, no matter how clear and accurate, would completely undermine the purpose of his initiation, which was to move him from a state of faith in second-hand descriptions of reality toward a state of knowledge through first-hand perceptions of reality. And this was perhaps the essential difference between the acousmatikoi and the mathematikoi of the Pythagorean school. The root of the word acousmatikoi concerns hearing, whereas the root of the word mathematikoi concerns learning. And so members of the first group are considered to be hearers, while members of the second group are considered to be learners. Because of the way our so-called education system works, assuming it actually does work at all, we may not understand the difference between hearing and learning. After all, in our public school classrooms, the teacher talks and writes on the dry erase board, and the students listen and take notes. At least in theory, that's what they're supposed to be doing. Then, if they can remember at least a certain percentage of what the teacher said, and repeat it back on the test, we say they learned. Really, though, they only heard. This is like the outer school of the acousmatikoi, or the hearers. But clearly learning is considered to be something different from merely hearing. Pythagoras is said to have coined the word mathematics. The word essentially means that which is learned. So what is it that's actually learned? If you remember back to one of your math classes, I think you'll find the answer. It isn't that you learn the sum of a particular series of numbers, but that you learn the method of addition. It isn't that you learned the value of a particular unknown variable in an equation, but that you learned how to solve for an unknown variable. Learning doesn't consist merely in hearing, but in doing as well. We find echoes of this Pythagorean idea in the Gospels, when Jesus says, "Don't be hearers of the word, or logos, but doers as well. Be doers, be learners, learn by doing, not by listening." At this stage, the student isn't listening to a one-way lecture. He's engaged in a two-way dialogue. Through the process of engaging in these dialogues, the student begins to perceive the structure of logical thought. As the teacher repeatedly points to logical fallacies in his arguments, the student learns to spot them himself. He learns how to expose contradiction. He learns how to identify and test a principle to see if it can be applied consistently and universally. When someone is first learning how to read, they don't recognize words at a glance. They begin by sounding out the syllables. But in time, they don't have to sound out every word anymore. They may even be able to recognize entire phrases at a glance. But this is a skill that must be learned through practice. It can't be taught just by giving a lecture. Sure, you could give a lecture on logical fallacies and so on, but it's only through the dialectical method and through engaging frequently in rational debate that you actually train your mind to perceive these kinds of things. You can't learn algebra or calculus just by reading the formulas in a math textbook. You actually have to work the problems. And you'll have to work a lot of problems before it really clicks and you're able to do it without much effort. Plato's dialogues offer some of the best examples of the dialectic I know of. If you read several of Plato's dialogues, you can begin to develop a sense of the method. Think of these as sample problems in a math textbook. In sample problems, the steps are shown and the answers are given. You don't actually learn to do math just by studying the sample problems, though. You have to actually work problems for yourself. But studying sample problems first allows you to just follow along and see if you basically understand the process before you try to do it on your own. For me, the value of studying Plato's dialogues isn't so much in the conclusions that are reached, but in the process by which these conclusions are reached. I believe I can point to flaws in some of the arguments presented in some of the dialogues, but this is only because I've trained my mind to recognize flawed logic in the structure of an argument. And studying Plato's dialogues helped me to do that. In the same way, I've encountered solutions to math problems in the back of a math textbook which were wrong. But it was that same math textbook that taught me how to check the solution to a math problem to see if it was correct or incorrect. And I think in the same way, my videos offer quite a few examples of the dialectical method, but I'm not too proud to admit the likely possibility that I may occasionally be a little off in one of my conclusions. But at this point, I'd like to offer a few things that you can actually apply in practice. The first would be to spend a period of time, maybe a few days, weeks, or even months, reflecting throughout the day on the fact that some unknown percentage of what you think you perceive is imaginary. Your perceptions of what's going on around you are all mixed up with your interpretations of what's going on around you. It's difficult to separate them, but it's a useful exercise to try and separate them. See if you can notice what you're actually perceiving and what you're projecting. There's nothing wrong with interpreting data. We have to. But practice being consciously aware of the way you interpret reality, and always be open to the possibility that your interpretation of reality might be mistaken. In other words, practice doubt. Practice being agnostic, and being aware of what you know that you know, what you know that you don't know, and also being aware that there may be things you don't know that you don't know, and maybe even things that you don't know you do know. I've seen a few books about Zen Buddhism that talk about the beginner's mind. I call this the mind of the initiate, but also exercise the mind of the adept, the mind of the philosopher. Ask yourself, how do I know this is true? What would I have to assume in order for this to be true? What necessary premise does this rest on? And can I either doubt or prove that premise? What conclusions would logically follow from this if this is true? Are any of those logical conclusions logically contradictory? What is the underlying principle here? Where else can I see this principle expressed? Can this principle be universalized or applied consistently? What would be the opposite of this principle? Can the opposite principle be shown to be logically contradictory? Another good one is who benefits. These are some good starting points. You can spend a week or two meditating on just one or two of these questions throughout your daily activities. Consider these questions when you're sitting in a class, or watching the news, or a YouTube video. I don't want to give a list of all the logical fallacies here, but you can easily do an internet search. Look over some of the logical fallacies. Focus on maybe 2 or 3 at a time, or whatever you feel comfortable with. And then, over the next week or so, look for those logical fallacies everywhere. You'll find that you get better at spotting them. After a while, you'll feel like you're actually starting to see the computer code instead of the graphic user interface. If you really want to exercise your critical thinking, I recommend spending time listening to viewpoints you disagree with. The logical fallacies will be easier for you to spot. But be willing to admit when a valid point is made too. As you get better at spotting logical fallacies, be sure to turn these tools on arguments in favor of your own position. In a few of my videos, I've criticized arguments that other people have given in defense of positions that I agree with. It doesn't mean the position is wrong. It just means that particular argument fails to support it. In order to learn to think rationally and see the truth clearly, it's absolutely crucial to practice detachment. Most people are attached to an ideology or a set of beliefs. They judge an argument as valid if it supports their beliefs and invalid if it challenges their beliefs. So a sincere desire to know the truth and a genuine willingness to give up your existing beliefs and ideologies is a necessary prerequisite, but is not sufficient by itself. It's also necessary to exercise your reasoning faculty. To hear the music of the spheres, you must first take the earplugs out of your ears. But you also have to train your ear. Some people seem to naturally have a better ear for music than others. but with practice, I believe almost anyone can develop a better ear for music. I think I'll end there. Thanks for listening. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you found this interesting, and share it on your social media. Also be sure to follow me on Patreon too. In the future, I'll be publishing exclusive content there that won't be available anywhere else. You can find the link in the description box below. Again, thanks for listening, and I hope you'll be a doer and not just a hearer. Peace.